Okay, great. Yes, thank you so much for coming tonight. Such a wonderful turnout. My name is Erin Giese, she, her pronouns, and I am president of the Northeastern Wisconsin Bird Alliance. We are a chapter of National Audubon, and our mission is to protect birds in the places that they need today, tomorrow, using science, advocacy, education, and on-the-ground conservation. We have a lot of goals as a chapter, but one of our main goals is to ensure that all people feel included and welcome in all aspects of the work that we do. Some of you may know we have a really intimate relationship with the Oneida Nation through the Oneida Bird Monitoring Program. And I'll just reflect and say that we really hold a deep respect to First Nations people. And I'd like to read our land acknowledgement statement. This is something that we read before all of our public events that speaks to the importance of First Nations communities. And to me, land acknowledgements are educational, certainly to share with others as a reminder that uh, non-Indigenous people like myself are living on ancestral homelands of Indigenous people. So for me, it feels personal when I read it and think about it. But note that while a statement is all well and good, certainly what matters the most is the actions that we take to support Indigenous people. So with that, I'm going to read our land acknowledgement. So New Bird Alliance acknowledges what is now northeastern Wisconsin as the ancestral homelands of the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, Ho-Chunk Nation, Forest County Potawatomi, Ojibwe Nation, and Ottawa Nation. These nations have deep spiritual and cultural connections to the land over which New Bird Alliance's membership area now extends. We are thankful to be able to carry out our mission to protect birds in the places they need within First Nations traditional homelands. We appreciate the important natural areas and resources provided not only for the evening community, but for our membership community as well. Today, the Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin and the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin inhabit this northeastern part of our state within our membership area and care deeply for its natural resources. We thank all 12 of Wisconsin's First Nations for their devoted stewardship and conservation of these lands, and we acknowledge the First Nations people of northeastern Wisconsin and are committed to honor and respect First Nations communities. That is available on our website if you'd like to read and learn more about ways to support First Nations communities. With that, I'm going to transition and get started with tonight's program. Just a reminder to please keep yourselves muted while on Zoom. Jennifer is open to accepting questions during the presentation. So if they're, particularly if they're relevant and needed for understanding and following her talk. So you're welcome to drop a question in the chat box if you like, or we can certainly address those questions at the end. So it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce you to Jennifer Lazewski. Jennifer is the executive director of the statewide organization, Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, which is a nonprofit founded in 1938 with the mission of promoting the enjoyment, study, and conservation of Wisconsin's birds. Really, really excited that there's an executive director now for that organization, as she's really been keeping that organization at the helm and leading the state in ornithology and bird conservation issues. Jennifer's also a master gardener volunteer with more than 10 years of experience in pollinator and hummingbird gardening, as well as a master naturalist with extensive experience in native plant gardening. And those are not trivial things to acquire. So well done, Jennifer, for earning those statuses. She's even been featured in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel about featuring articles on hummingbird and butterfly gardening, among other subjects. And Jennifer also designs and plants for birds, bees, and butterflies in her urban Wauwatosa garden. And I'll say I've listened to Jennifer's talk previously and was really, truly impressed at how well she manages to decorate her landscape, you know, kind of meeting the norms of society, of urban landscaping, but she does it with such an amazing job that it really helps our native pollinators, bees, butterflies, and birds, but it also looks fabulous. So It's one of the goals of our chapter is really to get people thinking about ways to help birds, which are in rapid decline over the last several decades. And her talk will really present you with ways to help birds and make a difference. So without further ado, I'd love to pass it to Jennifer. If you want to start sharing your screen and kick us off tonight. And again, thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks so much, Erin. I am so excited to be here and welcome to everyone this evening. It's always great to think about spring and summer things during the winter. And those seed catalogs are certainly out. Uh, that is another good incentive. A lot of the things that you may plant may need a cold treatment, so now is a great time to start some of that with some winter sowing. If you look up how to do that, it's really fairly simple. But we're going to walk through a little bit of, what you can do to enhance the native plants that attract pollinators and birds in your yard. And we'll talk about how if you have a good start, how you enhance that for birds. I am in a typical urban yard. I still have grass, unfortunately, but it's just a little bit easier that way. There's lots of ways to make room in your yard for things that matter. Doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a big designer. But it does help with your neighborly relations. And if you're willing to talk about it as you're doing it so that your neighbors can learn from you. So we'll go ahead and get started. I think the answers about why we garden for birds are pretty obvious. In Wisconsin, we are one of the biggest bird watching states in the nation. The latest poll is a little bit different from Fish and Wildlife, but they've changed a lot of things. But we know how popular birding is in the state. And fixing things or working with things in your yard is a great way to bring birds closer. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So while it's great to go out and see birds, backyard bird watching is also a wonderful thing. And I don't think anybody who's listening probably needs to keep hearing this, but we do keep saying it. As we lose those natural areas and habitat for birds, providing for them across our landscape, is one of the ways that we can be active in helping for conservation. Every little bit does help. And so the why native plants parts, well, this is natural for all wildlife that's native to the state and some of it that isn't. When you bring in plants that aren't native, as attractive as that is, and they might be easier for home landscaping, they're not serving purposes other than decoration. So they're not really enhancing or helping the wildlife that we're trying to support. So that's why we encourage people to plant native plants. The insects and animals have coexisted with these plants for a long, long, long time. So they interact, insects want to eat things, plants don't want insects to eat them. So there's a lot of back and forth with defenses and overcoming defenses that only happens over time. Those plants that come from mostly Eurasia or somewhere else in the world aren't adapted for our insects and wildlife. So you will see pollinators on them if they happen to have pollen, but overall the system is much better. And it really is amazing when you start putting these plants in how alive your yard becomes so quickly. I kind of take my little 10-15 minute meditations during the workday sometimes just by walking around the yard and seeing what's going on and noticing an insect I've never seen there before. So there's lots of added benefits for your own well-being also. So this is a little bit of change from we do everything in gardening for us to contributing to the natural world by doing this. One of the great parts of this is the blooms for pollinators. There's been a lot of talk about pollinator gardening, but people weren't necessarily catching this right away, is that the things that come from pollination is not just human food, but also food for all kinds of other wildlife, and that includes birds. So we've been over the last few years trying to emphasize more what's available for pollinators in spring, particularly those queen bumblebees when they come out and some of the native species that come out early in the season. And really, after the spring ephemerals or at the same time, the things that are blooming include all those shrubs. So it does include non-native shrubs as well, but the best thing is to have native shrubs for both pollinators at that key time, and then they produce berries, seeds, fruits that become food for birds later on. So the photos on the right, you'll also see some cone flowers. They are definitely a bumblebee and some of the leafcutter bee favorites. And goldfinches and other birds just love them once they've dried up after they've been pollinated. So we're going to talk a little bit about, if you have a pollinator garden already or you've been working on it, that is a great start. And then we're going to talk about the things you can do to enhance it for birds. So typically you see these lists of the requirements for, a pollinator or a butterfly garden. For the most part, aside from the spring ephemerals, you're working with areas that have sun. There aren't as many things that bloom and provide pollen in the shade later in the season. Shelter in terms of blocking the wind a little bit. Insects are light, they need to fly, giving them some protection at different times. So you're also looking primarily for strong nectar and pollen plants, and also plants that are host plants for insects. So when butterflies are in their caterpillar stage, they need to eat plants. So you want to have things that are useful for all parts of their life cycle. Then, something you can live without, but is generally recommended is water. For insects, they get more of their moisture kind of in the air, in the dew, a little bit of rain here and there. I've tried to be watering stations and butterfly stations and things like that, and they don't particularly use them, at least in a yard. Um, with birds, however, water is one of those things that helps pull them in. So having a bird bath or something with running water can be helpful in terms of drawing them in and helping to provide for them, especially as we get less and less rain. Um, Bird gardens can use shaded areas. A lot of the shrubs and trees we're going to talk about don't need to be in the sun. And grasses as well. So there are things that are helpful for birds that, because actually many homeowners have shade in their yards. That's one of the things we learned as master gardeners and designing gardens and talking to people. Part of why some houses are built where they are because they're in a wooded area, or they planted the trees when the houses were first built earlier in the century. So very few people have the full sun garden that I have. So it's a great advantage to me. But that's another thing when you're working with gardening for birds, is you can take advantage of more parts of your yard without necessarily changing them. Um, so we'll kind of run through more details on some of these. With the shelter and protection, we're talking not just from wind and things, but also from predators. And again, working to add plants that produce seed, fruit, nuts, things that birds eat. You also can bring in insect eaters if you're planning your garden right for birds. So how do we do that? We pump up the volume. So we more trees. Anywhere you could put a tree, it's great. Birds are going to use it. More shrubs. This is the layer that's most often overlooked, that's getting a lot more talk, especially native shrubs. More grasses and sedges. Gardeners like pretty plants, but without grass around them, a lot of those prairie plants flop. And also, in shady areas, sedges are great. We need to learn more to mix those things in with the pretty flowers that we have in our gardens. And most importantly, more bugs. So you're going to avoid using pesticides. You want to use native plants so that all kinds of insects are eating them. The goal is not to have perfect leaves, but it's to provide for others in wildlife. And like I said, it's more fun too. Um, So when you look kind of at the layers, and Doug Tallamy has a great book that talks a lot about the layering and what plants to use in landscape for birds. But this is kind of the general breakdown of it. You have the canopy, the tallest trees, then the understory trees, shrubs kind of in the middle. They might be almost as tall as some of the understory trees and, to barely above the ground. There's a lot of range in there. And then where most gardeners focus is on all these herbaceous plants. And that's almost a lot, sometimes the only layer they really work with. They'll take the trees that they have, they'll add shrubs right under the front windows, but there's a lot you can work with here. And then there's also the ground layer. So, things like moss and lichen instead of having grass that doesn't really grow, thinking about, what might drop seeds there and other things. So for birds, they use those higher layers. You want to have those in your yard. You want to have things that's as close to nature as possible in terms of what is there, what the birds can use, and bringing in different types of birds. Some birds might sing in the canopy, but they nest lower down, like cardinals. So anything you want to learn about the birds you want to bring into your yard can help you decide what kind of plants you want in there. So there's a couple of authors that do a really good job of that. Sally Roth is one of the ones that comes to mind for me because she has birds that are specific to what songbirds eat and, so, some different books like that. And the other person is actually here, Mariette Nowak, who has written a book specifically on native plantings for birds and gives you a lot of information on particular plants and how birds use them. So they also use the ground layer. And there's been a lot of talk about this. The figure on the left is what master gardeners know as the volcano mulch. That often municipalities do this. They pile the mulch high, they pile it right next to the tree trunk, which is not healthy for the tree. So not only do we not want to see that, but we want to see these natural layers right under trees for some very important reasons. So sorry, let me get back one. Back two, I guess. So there's kind of a new concept, relatively new, that's called underplanting or soft landings. It's something that Doug Tallamy talks about in his books. It's something that Heather Holm out of Minnesota as an insect person has been promoting. But one of the things that people didn't understand, they got the concept of plant all these oaks. That was one of Doug Tallamy's big messages, is that's one of the keystone species almost everywhere. It supports an incredible number of particularly Lepidoptera caterpillars, both moth and butterfly, which is a favorite food for baby birds. So you can't worry about what might be eating your tree leaves because it's great if something is eating your tree leaves. But some of those insects, as part of their cycle, drop with the leaves underneath the tree. So when you do rake all your leaves up and get them to the curb and have them taken away, you're also taking away all the insects that go with that. So you're trying to work more natural areas under your trees. It gives you a place for those insects. And generally, it's easiest to work with kind of lower plantings, more grasses, things that you don't have to worry about in there, or that you're not going to have to step in and trim down very much. But it also gives you a place to put those leaves when you're doing leaves to leaves, which we're going to talk about next. So you don't necessarily have to take everything out of your yard in fall when things fall. Now, something like oaks, the leaves last a little bit longer, so you may need to move some out, at various points because they're not going to decompose quite as quickly. So leave the leaves. On the left is one of my garden beds in April. So you can see things come through perfectly fine. Leaves get blown away with the winds in wintertime. It's not something that I'm particularly worried about. So I wait until spring to do my cleanup in most of my beds. Anything that's diseased, you certainly still want to get rid of for the health of your plants. So you can do some cleanup. But for the most part, I leave my stems, leave my leaves, and it's usually much nicer to do a lot of that work in spring than to try to cram it in fall in between wind and rainstorms and some good hikes, which I'd rather be out hiking in the fall. So there's kind of a shift in thinking. The photo that's not mine, not my yard. I can't claim this one, but it's one that's used in Wisconsin a lot to promote this idea. Is creating those layered beds that give you places to put your leaves. You're not going to be worried about mowing the lawn right next to them. So to give yourself those spaces when you're doing your planning. Um, a lot of the migrating sparrows that I see are in spring when they land in my yard and are rooting around looking for seeds, within all those beds that I haven't cleared out. So I don't know because they're not really feeder sparrows for the most part that I would be seeing them if I didn't have these things going on. So you're also helping to provide nesting materials when you're working with kind of leaving things in your yard. That includes some dead snags. You may have to take down the top of the tree for safety's sake, but you may choose to leave a good part of the trunk to see if it might get used and some birds move in or other wildlife. Um, I find milkweed stems, which is what you see in the upper right, you can see some things are kind of peeled back. That's a bit of swamp milkweed where it's a very strong fiber, what's left in that stem. So I don't cut those down generally either at all or until much later in the spring because orioles in particular, that's one of their favorite nesting materials. So I think robins must use it too. So I often see, strips kind of torn off from there. Hummingbirds and other smaller birds also use spider webs in their nests. So again, kind of leaving things natural gives them more opportunity to find that. Things like I do still have some clematis vines, anything that has kind of a downy fluff. In this case, you can see a sparrow going ahead on my dandelions in the lawn because I don't really go out of my way to kill them very much. And then, all of those stem trimmings and those fallen stems become things that birds can use. This kind of puzzled us for a while as we were working through as part of native solitary bees. They do a lot of stem nesting. How do you accommodate that and keep your yard a little bit cleaned up or, make sure it's, in good enough shape, especially for your front yard in your neighborhood? Heather Holm came up with kind of this diagram and, doing a better explanation of it. That basically you're trimming it off in spring. So you do it during the spring cleanup. The bees use it, the stems that are left that you've left at like that 12 to 18 inches during that summer. And most of the solitary bees take a whole year before they come out again. There are a few that, might have multiple generations in one summer, but for the most part, this is going to wait till next year. So you don't usually have to clean these up much. I mean, it's great because actually, especially when they're sturdy stems, things like Joe Pye or some of that milkweed or some other things, they help support your plants during that first summer. And then by the time the bees emerge the next summer, generally those stems aren't quite as strong. They'll tend to fall down the next summer, or you can go through and trim them out. Most of the time, I'm leaving them there. I leave a lot of that debris in my plant beds as long as it's healthy and it's not too much of it. So just kind of starting with some of the pollinator gardening principles, the point is to really try to spread your blooms out and have at least 3 to 5, maybe more overlapping at the same time. So the simplest rule is right plant, right place. Gardeners, we love to get all fancy and say, oh, I can put that in there because I really want that purple flower there. Um, but it is just such an easy thing to follow the label. to put things in the right place with the right amount of sun, you get more blooms and a healthier plant when you're planting for the plant rather than how you want to design things. So I really, really encourage people to follow that rule. Having healthier plants also means you're less likely to need to use pesticides of any sort. And we're really trying to get away from that. And your plants will be healthier without those things if you're putting the right plant in the right place. A variety of flower colors. This is a chart at one point of my backyard, so the colors kind of match what colors the flowers are. Different pollinators are attracted to different flower colors. So you increase the opportunities for them and the likelihood that something is going to be using it. A lot of times, white native plants I've found, tend to be more attractive to wasps. Some of them, especially the high summer ones. So you might want to put them a little further back in your yard and not right by your back door. But solitary wasps are like solitary bees. They're really not interested in stinging. So for the most part, you don't have to worry about them. Also, males don't have stingers. So it's really just those most social wasps for the most part that cause problems in terms of apprehension of being stung. So as I mentioned, the rule is kind of at least 3 to 5 species of flowering plants in bloom at all times. That includes your trees, your shrubs, your vegetables, your annuals, whatever you have, especially as our weather gets less predictable and we've had more droughts. Spreading them across this way, you tend to have shorter bloom times, or they start earlier or later than normal, kind of in their schedule, if there is such a thing anymore. So the more plants that you kind of have blooming and or ready to bloom at any given time, the better likelihood that you're actually going to have some overlap and 3 to 5 things going at the same time. It's a little bit different in our gardens because we can water things also. So they may have a little bit longer bloom time than you would out on a native prairie, say. We talked about native species and avoiding invasive plants. There are things in our garden that people don't understand are invasive in natural settings. So the DNR does have an invasive plant list. You should check because some of those things are not to the point that they're not sold in nurseries. They will still be sold in nurseries, but it's not something that you want to have in your yard. And weeds get to be a little bit of an issue. I'm a little looser in my backyard than my front yard. Also because some of, especially the annual weeds, provide a lot of seeds that birds actually do use. So, you don't always have to be perfect. You just do the best you can. It's also been awful hot a lot of the time to be out there weeding the last couple summers. For birds, you're really thinking about their annual cycle and where they are in that. So for now, we've got our all year long birds that are here in winter, but then we've also got the migrants that came down from a little further north. You've got snowy owls coming through and a few things that we don't see in the summertime. And some of our summertime birds are way south of here, and some just a little bit south of here. So with spring, they're talking about energy for migration for the birds coming through. So being an oasis during migration time for birds can be crucial for some of those birds, especially those of us who live along the lakefront, because a lot of birds come through that going north. And then you've also got getting into feeding baby birds and adults, trying to get quicker energy as they're doing all that. So there's a lot more insect eating, even for most of the generally seed eating birds. They're often feeding insects to their young. So that's the time where you want to have all those great moth caterpillars in the yard and, everything kind of in full tilt. Once the birds may have 2 or 3 rounds of nesting depending on the species. Then once they're done with that, they're molting feathers. So they need protein to replenish and build their new feathers, which are made of keratin or protein. So they have some different needs. They can't always fly as well. So they might not be moving around as much to find their food. So it can be really important to have things that provide that protein during that time. Then you get into building up fat for either migration or winter. So nature has this amazing thing where berries turn from mostly carbon sugar berries when that high energy is needed earlier in the summer to more fat intensive berries. So, nature has kind of helped with all of this and what birds need at certain times. And then you go back into the winter cycle. Did we have any pause that we needed? Were there any questions, Aaron? Or
No, there are no questions in the chat.
okay. Hopefully that means I'm being good and clear. Okay. So we're going to talk about some of the types of food for birds. You've got bird feed, you've got things that will come to the feeder either through on migration or during the year. I always love having those rose-breasted grosbeaks come through for like that week-long window for me. I'm not in a natural enough area where they hang around the whole time. Um, but also, as I mentioned, those birds that only eat on the ground that don't necessarily come to feeders as readily. For some of those seed eaters, actually the food that you can provide may be more attractive than what's in the feeder. You can see in that kind of center picture is my thistle feeder by my garage, and it's right next to a bunch of giant purple hyssop, which we're going to talk about later. And the goldfinch are on the plants, not on the thistle feeder. So, there are ways that you can provide, especially as, birdseed gets more and more expensive, that even though plants cost money, it's, might be a less costly way to bring birds into your yard than constantly refilling the feeder. With berries, birds help move them around. So, along with other animals. So, that's part of why there's that fruit around the seeds that makes it attractive for animals to eat it and carry it away from the immediate site. As I mentioned, you've got timing with natives in terms of them providing exactly the right nutrition for what birds need at the right time of year. But the invasive plants may have berries and you may see birds eating it, but they're not as nutritional for birds. So having those plants in your neighborhood, and I think, as I keep mentioning, that's one of the best areas of growth that we're seeing, especially with native plant sales and nurseries, is getting more native shrubs into people's yard. With insects, you're not going to see those warblers and other insect eaters. They're not going to come to your feeder the way that some other birds are. So if you're not spraying in your yard and insects are thriving in your yard, you're going to possibly see some of those birds. I'm kind of in a bend in the Menominee River in the Milwaukee area. So I do have warblers come through and I do see them in the bushes. So it's really great opportunities for you to see some of those birds right in your yard, especially during migration time. But the other bigger factor, and again, Doug Tallamy has written a lot on this, and he's actually an entomologist who is using birds to help show how these ecosystems need to work, and why we should be working with native plants rather than foreign plants, is that caterpillars are such a huge factor for nesting birds and the continuation of a lot of the birds we love, like chickadees, that they really need to have massive amounts of caterpillars nearby because they're just that perfect protein for chicks and growth. So everybody was, spraying everything to try to get rid of anything that they considered icky. And that had a real impact on birds. We're fairly certain, and science is showing that, there's differences between yards that have native plants and yards that don't in terms of the number of birds that support, the health of those fledglings and all kinds of things like that. So again, it's something, we really encourage, and it is a huge issue right now because of the spraying and the treatments that are happening with emerald ash borer. So that can be one of the side effects. There are insects that that's one of their biggest food sources, including things like tiger swallowtails. So when you put this all together, if you've started with a pollinator gardening, or you've got some of your herbaceous plants and perennial plants, down below, you can start mapping out then. And I've just kind of done it by month because that's usually the best information you can find. But most of the native plant nurseries, Prairie Nursery, Prairie Moon Nursery in Minnesota, and other information can help give you, information about when those plants bloom. And then it's who they're also serving. So this is an example of something that I did when I was working with our local nature center for an area that had a bit more of a wetland. We wanted almost every plant to have some kind of wildlife service that it was providing, and that it would help bring in things because it was a big, visitor attraction part of the area, that they'd be able to see this wildlife there and hopefully choose to do this in their own yards too. So again, that staggered bloom time for pollinators also means that you have staggered food time for birds. And these are some examples from my yard. It was a very good year where everything was in good shape. I can't say that happens every year, but it really doesn't take that much space. You can see I've still got some grass. I don't necessarily have that big a yard. Where you see that juniper tree in the background is actually my neighbor's. We have a very weird height differentiation between one block and uh, on our block. So my neighbor's first floor is almost at the same level as my second floor, which causes a lot of interesting drainage problems in our whole neighborhood. So, I found some ways to work with that, but that's really how I started working with natives, because I had these very wet spots right between our yard where all that water was flowing, and no cultivated plants were staying there. They just kept dying over the winter. And it's full sun. So at least at that point it was. So I started learning other plants that were already adapted to those conditions. And that's one of the other great things about natives, is that they take your yard as is. You find the plant to match your soil rather than trying to change all your soil or your soil pH to, or moving water around on your property so that you could put the plant you want to put there. This is much easier on you, on your yard, on the environment, that you're taking the conditions you already have and finding the best plants for that. So I do still have some things that are not completely native, as you could see in the photo with my hummingbird feeder. It was originally my hummingbird garden. That was a mix of some things that had lighter soil conditions. I now have a shrub in there, but it's also where I put in now some native thistle, so that it's right by my back porch and I can see all the things using it. So we'll talk about that at the very end, because I know it's not an easy thing for everybody to consider. But the last photo is just a little foot of soil that is really sandy, crappy soil that was full of bishop's weed when I first got my house. So that's a super invasive cultivated plant. It was the variegated version that a lot of different houses have. And I was very, very lucky that it was in a confined space. That thing along the side of my house is not connected to any of my gardens. So I spent years trying to figure out what to plant there. I tried all kinds of phlox and cultivated things, and it would just never seem to work out until I started putting in native plants. So you'll still see some tall salvias for the hummingbirds, and all the trellises have hummingbird vines and some other things that help enhance the space. But for the most part, I call it my little Waukesha County prairie. Um, for here, kind of Milwaukee County is a lot of clay soil. Waukesha County out in the Kettle Moraine area has a lot of gravelly, sandy soil. So because this is such a crappy bed, it actually was a little microsystem for a lot of plants that I can't grow anywhere else in my yard. So you'll see a lot of mountain mint there. It's the place where my butterfly weed has finally gone crazy. Usually it dies out over the winter and most of the rest of the yard. So learning your yard and figuring out some of those little spots that you can do things that are a little bit different can also be really fun. So when you're planting for birds, really think about those trees and shrubs. I'll like keep saying that again and again. And there's, it provides those early blooms, food for birds, also shelter for everyone. And it helps with that more natural appearance with layering. And a lot of those shrubs actually have strong winter interests. So that's a dogwood showing red colors in the fall down on that lower right. So just a couple of examples of things that are, really fun and good for birds. Serviceberry is popping up everywhere in the nurseries. It is just, it gives you those spring blooms, so you don't necessarily have to have a crabapple or a magnolia, things like that to get it. It comes in both tree and shrub form, and that food disappears pretty fast. So if you want to use some of it yourself, you have to beat the birds to it, but I let that go. It also turns generally a lovely red color, and for a lot of the species, and it is okay. It's hard to find a true native. There are a lot of different cultivars that are perfectly fine for those. Um, Hackberry is something that's really on the rise, and a lot of people have been talking about because it's a quick growing tree. It can be used as a street tree. It's actually the alternate tree on my city block. If you don't know this, for example, in the Milwaukee area, there's a whole plan for which trees go on which blocks. So there's a primary, a secondary, and kind of a decorative. So that's generally their go-to. And I just found out, thankfully, finally, my European linden is going to be, or basswood is going to get taken out. Because it hasn't been growing very well lately, and we'll see what they put in, because as they kind of plant a whole street with some of these trees, they end up having disease issues, or they're all kind of falling out around the same time. So a lot of municipalities are giving you more choice about your trees, or you can research what you can put in. And so this is one that's often coming up, and it does host a whole bunch of caterpillars also. Wild cherry and plum is, something that's real obvious in terms of fruit, as well as pollination or pollinator nectar for pollinators. Some people don't like it because of the spikiness of it. You might not want to have it with younger kids, but it's certainly you should put in if you can. We've talked about oaks already, and hawthorns are another one where birds like being there because they're more protected with the spikes, and it also has a fruit that birds will use. Conifers are incredibly important for shelter. Anybody who has those arborvitae hedges, or neighbors who have that clinging on blue spruce in the front yard. I mean, those are huge havens for birds, even if they're not necessarily native. But, we really want to encourage more planting of native conifer trees, and especially for those cedar waxwings. So you have a wide variety of options. Some things are cultivars. That is unfortunately my Chinese juniper. But there are, landscaping plants that still provide things for birds, even if they're not exactly, what you might have in nature. Shrubs, some of the biggest ones for birds. I have black chokeberry in my yard. It's a beautiful shrub. For me, it's taking a little while to grow because I don't have a really wet spot for it. But it replaced a huge invasive honeysuckle in my backyard. Elderberry is awesome if you have the space for it. I keep trying to figure out how I can work one in, but they can just get very, very big. But they are huge for both insects and birds. There's all kinds of different dogwoods. Again, some of them take up more room than others. On that right side is the berry of the silky dogwood, which takes a little more moisture and also blooms, and the berries appear later in the summer. So it's one of those options to kind of help stretch your berry season. Brambles are great. Birds love the protection factor as well as being able to grab those berries. So I know, in the city, a fair number of people I know have them behind their garage or in places where, they're not quite as much bother. Grasses and sedges I've mentioned before, but if you think about the fact that grass has grass seed, that provides a lot of seeds for birds, both, in natural prairies, which is mostly what is photographed here. On that lower left, the, Canadian rye that provides a really early pioneer plant in prairie plantings. It'll take up a lot of space, but it's generally an annual grass, so it's not going to be there forever. And then you've got birds that, nest in the grass. So they really need those grasses to be there. Just a couple of examples of perennials that are, especially good for birds, where there's a lot of seed, where they eat that seed, and where you have a couple of options, so that if your yard has clay soil, you use like the regular purple coneflower. It's not strictly native here, but it's close enough, and it's such a versatile, easy plant that it's hard to say, you shouldn't be using it. Pale purple goes with those dry areas. And yellow coneflowers you'll see out on most of the prairies. That works in a lot of different areas. So you often have different pollinators on these different varieties or species, and then you'll also see different birds. But I would say, this is definitely a goldfinch favorite on any of these varieties. So I mentioned giant purple hyssop, or purple giant. I have it because it's a rusty patch bumblebee favorite, and I do have rusty patch bumblebees in my yard and around my area in Wauwatosa. So that's why I planted it. The added bonus was the goldfinches also love that. They tend to take it a little earlier and not necessarily wait for when the seed is, particularly dry. But it's in that porch garden that used to be more of a hummingbird garden, and I think it's been a great addition because it brings those goldfinches right outside my kitchen window. Um, Blazing Star generates a lot of seed. So again, there's a lot of different ones for different soil and wetness conditions. The showy or meadow, the Ligula stylus, is an absolute monarch magnet. Um, for me, it's kind of a 3 to 5 year plant, and swamp milkweed is kind of the same for me. So some plants do great in gardens, and some have a little more limited life in gardens than they would necessarily out in the wild. But that's one of those that I'll just replace all the time. The same thing with something like cardinal flower for hummingbirds. They definitely use it. So I just kind of on a rotating basis buy, 3 or 4 every year from my native plant sale, put them in a different section of the yard. So if I lose some, I've still got, other ones going. And at the end of the season, asters have a lot of pollinator benefit, especially something like the October skies aromatic or any of the aromatic asters. They go to the very end of the season. This is also a time where your annuals can sometimes factor in because they go longer for pollinators and generating seeds for birds also. Um, and just to mention, I always have a few native thistle now. It's something I think is incredibly important. It's a tremendous food for those new queens that come out at the end of the season for bumblebees. So what you see on the right is a rusty patched bumblebee queen. And generally you see them almost exclusively on thistle towards the end of the season if it's available. But what I found as a master naturalist who works in more landscape work is that especially in more urban nature centers, things like that, it can be very hard to do native thistle where it should be. You have a couple of obstacles. You have people who don't understand that there are native thistles. There are people who think that all thistle is bad and should be eliminated. And there is a lot of bad thistle on most natural areas, on a lot of farms, a lot of things. There's a lot of different types of thistle. Um, but promoting the ones that are native, like field thistle, I have tall thistle, and it's the other was a wetland thistle. That having some of those around is incredibly important for wildlife. But the other obstacle is that often the volunteers who help with a lot of that landscape management work, they don't know the difference. So staff can plant those thistles and then all of a sudden they disappear 3 weeks later. So it can get to be a little frustrating, but it's incredibly important for these resources to be available both for pollinators, and it's a huge goldfinch favorite. I always have right around molting time a whole bunch of goldfinches in that thistle eating away. So, and I was amazed at how all the other wildlife came to them. Every type of swallowtail, I had more monarchs on the thistle than on everything else I usually saw them on before during their migration time. So just to give them a little bit plug, if you have a little section in your backyard or your back 40 where you can put them in, it's a great thing to do for wildlife. And there are some annuals. I do a lot of container planting still. That's where a lot of my hummingbird plants come in. I sprinkle around some of the taller stick verbena that you see on the right. And for some reason, the goldfinches are always in there even before it goes to seed. What you see in the back with the goldfinch on it is one of those container decorative millets. It actually generates millet seeds. So there are ones with gold leaves or purple leaves, and they actually do produce seed that the birds eat. And obviously sunflower seeds where you have to fight the squirrels and everything else who would love to take the whole head off. But you definitely see birds on there also. And then your specialty hummingbird plants. Most of those are annuals. There are some natives that you may see them in, but if you really want to have them in your yard, there's a couple specialty ones. The great thing is a lot more of the nurseries have them. I used to have to mail order some things, I'll admit. But it is really fun to have some around. This is a Rucellia that the hummingbird is in here. It's kind of a dry weather plant that has a lot of those red blooms. Grows into a bush in some places, but not here. So I put that in a hanging basket for the hummingbirds. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I have really enjoyed getting a chance to talk with you about birds and gardening for birds. So I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody would like to ask some.
I'm gonna virtually clap for everybody. I know it's kind of anticlimactic when you finish an online lecture, but this was fantastic. As always, Jennifer, your knowledge about native plants and how they tie to the needs of insects and birds always impresses me. How many things you know. It's
Well, it's
incredible.
fun. Yeah.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you find it fun, and I appreciate how you share this knowledge in a way that's easy to understand. And I also really like that you point out that like not everything is native in your landscaping, but the majority is, and that some natives are better than none. And you're able to kind of explain things in a really nice way for everybody with different conditions.
Yeah.
So as I delayed and chatted a little bit, there are questions coming in. I have a question as well, but I'm going to get to the chat first. Edwin asked, could you please drop the names of the authors and books you mentioned in the chat? And also said, thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I think
Le
those were the main two I mentioned, and then of course Marriott.
okay. Oh, wow, are you fast? Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Laura says, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Jane says, do you have any recommendation for ground cover plants under pine and spruce trees? That's a really good question. I'm interested in
Yeah,
hearing.
that can be a tough one. Because it also depends, you can do more, put more things, different things in when you're putting a tree in new than when a tree is 20 years old, and you don't necessarily want to disturb a lot of roots and things like that. I mean, sedges are a good bet, in that situation. There are many that are adapted more to shade. Um, and I'm trying to think in terms of natives, yeah, because generally one of the best covers is wild strawberry, which will grow under all conditions, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily, one of the best for that much shade and dry. Um, yeah, since I don't have many trees in my yard, I'm not quite as good with that. I should be a little quicker with it because I know it's a common question. Um, I think those are probably the things that are off the top of my head. I'd be happy to send some more too if I take a quick look and have anything, I'll feed it to Erin and she can pass it around too.
Yes, happy to do that. I can
But
send that
yeah,
to you
that's
quickly.
another area where you can put a container in with some, beautiful shade annuals. And, that'll give you a little bit of color and fill some space too, as long as it's within reach of a hose or a watering can. So, in some cases where if you're not that into moss and lichen and other things, don't forget you can always just bring something in. Not everything has to be planted in the ground.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going back up. John says, thank you, Jennifer. They will be trying to focus on shrubs more. Yep, that's the good advice that Jennifer provided. Someone says, is there a
Yeah, I
good
see
way
the
to
thistle
distinguish
question.
between, yeah, so I'll read it. Is this a good way? Is there a good way to distinguish between native thistle and other invasive thistles?
Most of the stuff that would fly into your yard would likely be invasive thistle. The only way to know for sure you have native is to plant it yourself. It's not something that's readily available in nurseries, but it's pretty easy to grow from seed. It's a 2-year biennial plant. But what I found is that once you have it around, it's not that hard to pull things the first year when you see them if you don't want them in those places. But it also then transitions to I didn't plant the second year in my great experiment because I had brand new neighbors with little kids, and they were supposed to flip and move out, so I was trying to be nice, but it ended up by the time I hit the fourth year, nature takes care of these things, and even though I didn't plant any in the second year that should have been ready in the fourth year, I still ended up with a couple of plants that fourth year. Um, Out in nature, one of the only ones that you can kind of distinguish unless you really start studying them and know which is which. Usually those things that are low to the ground and super prickly are bull thistle or Canadian thistle. Um, the field thistle or discolor species, if you flip it over, it has a gray underside to the leaf, but I do believe I've read that they can also interbreed with Canadian thistle, so it's not guaranteed. I don't know that I would go around planting thistle seeds that you gather from, a natural area, if it's okay to gather things there. I have done, order the seeds and be sure what you're getting. And then, most of the time in my yard, I can spot the difference pretty easily from how that basal growth goes. The native thistles have a much bigger, flatter leaf, kind of when they started off with that low growth the first year.
Oh, good, really good advice. Thank you.
Hmm.
Laura says, I'm sorry I came in late. I noticed you are recording. Can you explain how we can access the recording? Yes, that is a question I can answer. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat to share. Oh, that didn't work out very nicely. Hang on. I'll drop the link in the chat of where we keep the recordings. They are stored on New Bird Alliance's website. Sometimes we post it to our Facebook page, but they will definitely end up on our website. Cindy says, thank you, wonderful information. Alan says, thanks, Jennifer, very helpful, has just given me ideas for an area I just cleaned out.
That's
Susan
good to
says,
hear.
yeah, exactly. It's great. Susan says, thanks for all of this important information. What do you do with the worm hammocks that appear in my trees? Leave them for birds or cut off the branch and get rid of it?
I assume you're talking about kind of the web caterpillar hammocks that can develop. And then it really depends if it's an invasive species, like what used to be the gypsy moth, that's now what the springy form moth or something else like that. Where it's an invasive one and you don't want it around. But there are also, ones that are native web caterpillars that are really a big boon for birds. So try to figure out what the identification is on it. You can get caterpillar ID books out of the library. You can post something on a naturalist. You can, ask somebody at a garden event sometimes. So, you try to get the information always about something before you're killing it off. And so there are things that you may want to remove or you may want to spray where you're in an invasive, really bad situation like that. But you really want to identify before you do that.
Yes, agree. Thank you. Another question came in. Ethan, if I have a small area, would it be more important to get a larger tree that can reach the higher layers but take up more space, or a smaller tree to get more real estate for more diversity of other sedges, flowers, shrubs?
I think it also depends on the area. You don't necessarily want larger trees close to your house, if it's further out and what you can spend, because cost is a factor and time is a factor. So it's great to plant an oak now, but it might be 20 or 30 years before it becomes a significant large tree. And are you going to be able to protect it in the meantime, especially if you have wildlife around? So sometimes it may be better to go with a smaller tree and be able to, get a bigger one and underplant it right away. The more you can kind of do a whole garden bed all at once, the easier it is to get everything in that you want and not disturb the tree roots. So, some of it is what you want and need, and some of it is, what are you trying to do with your yard? For some of us, we might only have one tree opportunity because that's as much space as we have. So, you may want to take advantage of it. But a lot of us inherited trees, at least in my area of Milwaukee and Wauwatosa, where we had that one blue spruce that everybody put in front of their house, that it's not a native and it was too close to the house. Then we all had to spend big money to take them out when we realized it was about to fall into our bedroom window. So, you want to think ahead and figure out what your goals are in your yard. And maybe you want to have that shade, as we get warmer. And, you want to help prevent that heat island effect, or you want to have a spot where you can go and relax under there. So your yard is always you know, the design of what you're doing always depends on what your goals are, what you're trying to do with it, and what is the most important to you, because that human factor does come into consideration. If you want to have a tree where you don't have to worry as much about, underneath it, maybe you do want a tall tree and you just don't, remove the leaves right away. Rather than have something lower if you have kids running around and dogs running around and whatever else. So, there is still allowable considerations for what you want in your yard and your enjoyment.
For a second there, I thought you were talking about my house with our spruce trees.
Yeah, and I know
It's a
there
thing.
some other
Yeah.
places where there's just too many trees, and
Hmm.
so it all depends on what you want out of your yard and what you feel comfortable with and tending. So
Exactly. Any other questions? I don't, unless I missed some in the chat, or you can come off mute. I did forget to mention that. Oh, Ethan followed up after that question, said, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. This was super cool.
yeah, and I
Anyone have
do
any other?
recommend that, especially that Living Landscape book by Doug Tallamy. It can be really helpful for sorting through some of the options and those layers and things like that. But that was that's been out for a while, so there are more people writing both on lawn replacement and in, how to do a more natural yard. There's also, I forgot, an Audubon bird gardening book by Stephen Kress. I'll try to drop that into the chat. That, it's national in scope, but it's generally pretty available in local libraries too. Um, and I think that's actually an Audubon book. And so there's a more recent version and an old version. So the more recent version kind of incorporates more of that how to landscape and some of the factors you should think about.
I'm gonna drop one more, another thing in the chat from Audubon. Audubon plants for birds would be
Hmm.
another resource as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think they're one of the ones that if you put your zip code in, it keys into Doug Tallamy's Keystone Plant List.
Oh, nice. So that's how it's integrated. Yeah. That's the site
Yeah,
I'm
so I
familiar
think
with where
both,
you can enter the zip codes. Helpful.
yeah, that and WWF also, now I'll forget what it is, wildlife, uh, oh, NWF, National Wildlife Federation. They have a section on planting for wildlife and some books and things too. And they have a connection with Doug Tallamy and his Keystone plants.
There we go. I just found the link you're talking about.
Yeah.
Excellent advice. And there was one other source I wanted to share. If you're looking to buy local in this part of Wisconsin, up here near Green Bay, to check out Stone Silo Prairie Gardens, which is in like the De Pere Ledgeview area.
And the DNR also runs a native plant website that has native plant sale information and native plant nursery information for other parts of the state.
Yeah, I found that one too. Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah,
That's
happy to
extremely
help.
helpful, like thinking about it across statewide if you're not in Green Bay. Oh, nice. All these are great resources on DNR. One other question. Edwin says, what was the Minnesota nursery website you mentioned?
Yeah, I just added it in. So.
Already on it. Oh, Prairie Moon. Yeah, yeah. Yes, I have a seed box
Yeah,
from
so
them.
they tend to have a little smaller, more regular seed packets that cost you like $2, $3. So I tend to get my seed from there. They also have different offerings. Some of the native plant nurseries are more local ecosystem than others. So one of the things that I love in my yard is there's a native delphinium. I used to love growing big English delphiniums and getting frustrated about that every year because they're not that easy to grow. But there's a native one that actually does a little better in shade, which has now worked its way into my hummingbird garden on that back porch. So unfortunately, it blocks my view from one of the chairs, but it's a particular favorite of some of the rarer bumblebees, the yellow or furvidus, which look very different, and some of the big black and golds that I don't see as often in my yard. And I see hummingbirds in it too. So it's not quite as big and showy, as the non-native delphiniums, but it fills a really good spot and it is a native, and that, for example, is only available through Prairie Moon Nursery. So
Great. Well, I think that's the end of the questions, Jennifer, and really thank you again. I always learn something new from you, and I can tell from all the comments that everyone really enjoyed it. So we really appreciate your time, and I hope everyone is now challenged with the task of doing something for your property, big or
yeah.
small.
And the catalogs from those nurseries can sometimes be a real good resource, even if you only get them once, because they do some of that ecosystem grouping for you. You know, if it's sun and wet, here's the plants that you should use. You know, if it's shady and dry, here's the plants you should use. So that can help you walk you through some of the beginnings of that also. So
That's
thank
great.
you all for coming. It was really great to be here, and I hope you have a good time with your new plantings this year.
Already thinking about spring. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night. Thanks for tuning in. Bye, Jennifer.